I want to welcome everybody. I want to express my gratitude for your presence on a beautiful Friday in the springtime. For me, it's a wonderful refuge from so much other things in my life to be able to create space to listen to young people talk about their research. I'm thrilled to be here. So welcome to panel 2, titled Remembered Through Language. And as will become rapidly clear, one of the unifying threads here is the presence of oral history methodology. I'd like to introduce our first presenter. Seyoon Chun is a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences, majoring in history. Originally from New York, his primary research interests revolve around the Korean diaspora, the practice of oral history, and the influence of Christianity on a global scale. His current project examines the role of American missionaries in 20th century Korea and the key role churches serve in the lives of contemporary Korean Americans. Outside of the classroom, Seyoon is part of Aspire, where he teaches local Philadelphia high school students about Asian American history and plays piano and viola as part of an ensemble group. Please join me in welcoming him.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today before everyone. So like Professor Farnsworth mentioned, my project is titled Kyulpo Identity, Contemporary Korean American Community Building in Christian Churches. Through this presentation, I first seek to contextualize the meaning of Kyulpo through historical vignettes, documenting the history of Korean American immigration in the early 20th century. I then highlight my source base, consisting mostly of oral histories and archival material, where I conducted interviews with the Emmanuel Church of Philadelphia, a Korean Presbyterian immigrant church in West Philly, and the Reformist Congregational Fellowship, also in West Philadelphia. Oh, take your time. Thank you so much. Okay. Oh, yeah. There we go. Thanks. Before diving into content, I wanted to briefly situate modern-day Korean American life with brief statistics and definitions. So my title refers to Kyulpo, which is defined as an ethnic Korean born or raised outside of the Korean peninsula. And aside from literal definitions, Kyulpo is typically used in reference to Korean Americans, who are the highest diasporic population of Koreans living outside of the Korean peninsula. Kyulpo has also historically been used in a very derogatory manner, kind of denoting, used to reference Korean Americans kind of as sojourners outside of the peninsula or the motherland, in reference to those who have lost touch with their native cultures and languages. So I intentionally use Kyulpo to recapitulate and reclaim agency to Korean Americans who I believe retain their cultural identities in unique ways, but also to highlight their struggle being caught between a crossroads of not American enough and not Korean enough. And as they are often raised in racially isolating environments, church has emerged as a space of community building for Korean Americans, if not simply an excuse to use Korean language once a week, eat Korean food after sermons, and simply be surrounded by other Koreans on a weekly basis. And here I present very brief statistics of a study conducted in 2022 from the Pew Research Center. I want to point out that Korean Americans are nearly twice as likely as South Koreans, native South Koreans, to identify as Christian, at 59% versus a stark 32%. At the same time, Korean American adults are much less likely than adults in South Korea to be religiously unaffiliated, at 34% versus another 52%, or to be Buddhist. Buddhism is the historic religion of South Korea, which is at 3% versus a 14%. These religious differences between Korean Americans and South Koreans may partly be due to the faith backgrounds of immigrants who have moved to the United States from South Korea in recent decades. Migrants often go to countries where their religious identity is already very prevalent, and the US is the world's top destination for Christian migrants globally. Interestingly, most Korean American Christians, 87%, say that religion is important in their lives, as do a similar share of South Korean Christians, another 87 versus 82%. However, Korean American Christians are much more likely than their counterparts in South Korea to say that religion is very important in their lives, 58% versus 39%. So without a doubt, Korean American identity is tangentially related to Christianity, but the question arises, where did this pattern emerge from, and who influenced it? And the answer lies, I believe, with the complex and rich history of missionary activity in South Korea. In the late 19th century, Protestant American missionaries diffused into Korea in the midst of encroaching Japanese imperialism. Alongside spiritual messages of afterlife and empowerment, which ran contrary to the dogma of Confucian world order, which didn't really focus on afterlife, missionaries also brought with them education, founding the first Korean universities, introducing Western medicine, and put forward novel ideas of modernization. In the span of a few decades, the number of Korean Christians on the mainland expanded exponentially. This is even more remarkable when considering that today, of the 50 largest megachurches in the entire world, 23 exist in South Korea. In addition to revolutionizing Korean society, these missionaries played a massive role in facilitating the immigration of the first waves of Korean immigrants to Hawaii, where plantation workers sought out cheap Asian labor. The Koreans that immigrated then founded the first Korean churches, namely in Lee Syngman. Lee Syngman later would become a very famous revolutionary leader and the first president of the Republic of Korea, who founded this church, the Christ United Methodist Church in Hawaii himself. So thus the historical Korean American identity was fundamentally shaped by Christianity, indicating an inignorable relationship between religiosity and the so-called Kyopo identity. Oops, keep doing that. Currently, literature that has investigated Korean American spirituality analyzes the multiple interpretations of Christianity in the Korean American space. For instance, Sharon Kim highlights how Korean Americans are fashioning faiths of their own, using Korean churches along the West Coast and LA as her primary source base. Other scholars broadly define Korean Americans under the direct influence of the traumas of the Korean War, on an upwardly mobile trend since they did not inherit their parents' linguistic and cultural barriers. They are highly educated, typically, and are in high-paying positions in society. I assert, however, that this is a stereotype and that Korean Americans today are not necessarily directly influenced by the traumas of Korean War, unlike their grandparents' generation. In other words, by overemphasizing the tragedy of American cultural hegemony over the peninsula in the 1950s, scholars inadvertently downplay the agency of Native Koreans' participation on the war front and the reconstruction of the Republic. Churches are undoubtedly spaces for community engagement, providing unparalleled support for new immigrants to acclimate to American life. But churches may also exclude those who do not subscribe to norms of gender hierarchy, heterosexuality, or these conservative values. I highlight, in the next slide, the pervasive questions of Korean Americans that Korean Americans are asking themselves and the institution of church as they struggle to reconcile their triangulated identities of Korean, Christian, being queer, woman, or anything outside of a broad expanse of a Christian normativity. As I mentioned earlier, I conducted 14 oral histories with non-denominational and Presbyterian churches, Christians here in Philadelphia, 2 of which are currently practicing pastors, and the rest being non-pastors. The interviews were done in English and Korean, whichever they were more comfortable in speaking. And if you can see the age range here, the age range from my interview is gathered from 22 to 62 years old. And so I would hesitate calling an interview with a 22-year-old a formal oral history. But the reason why I decided to include those perspectives is because I felt like it would be because they came from Christian LGBT backgrounds, and so they were queer. So I felt that it would be extremely remiss of me not to include their perspectives. And so I generally inquired into themes of Christianity in relation to their immigration stories, childhoods, upbringings, influence on social relationships, family relationships, political ideology, and many, many other topics. And what emerged are common themes of isolation, exclusion, complemented by a sense of nostalgia for the church. So to justify my methodology, I wanted to read this quote from Nam Hae-in, or she goes by Sharon, her English name, one of the interviewees from this project. She describes her struggle in coming to college and thinking about her identity after decades of attending church. She says, I rethought a lot about the existential questions, but after coming to college and having my separation from religion, I thought about why am I living this life and why do I want to live it? Orienting my studies to answer those questions. Now I have to answer those questions for myself. Religion, to a certain extent, answers these fundamental questions of existence by providing roadmaps of who are you, why do you go on, and the crucial, why do you live? By stepping away from religion, Hae-in and many other Korean Americans had to confront this void of the unknown by herself without an instruction manual. Hae-in's dilemma is the heart of the struggle of many Korean Americans who are treading new ways to carve out liminal spaces where they can reconcile their identities. I want to begin with an interview conducted by Lee Kyung-gon, or Stephen, who retells the story of his coming out to his youth pastor. Growing up, Stephen had enjoyed attending church, where he met with Korean friends and ate Korean food after sermons, as I mentioned earlier, on a weekly basis. However, in his youth, he recounts, I was asking very important questions about my body and sexuality. There were some people who were misinformed. When I was telling one pastor who I really trusted about my doubts, she told me, "Those doubts you're having is the Holy Spirit at work," essentially denying his sexuality. Feeling unsafe and too American, Stephen left the church, a Korean immigrant church, to attend a white American church with his older sister, where he became acquainted with the clergy and grew to appreciate its less hierarchical structure. And although the American church was much more accepting of his identity, he could not escape the feeling that he did not fully belong due to his racial status. As a result, citing feelings of nostalgia, Stephen returned to another Korean immigrant church the following year whilst hiding his queer identity. Assimilating back into the Korean church proved to be very arduous for Stephen, who again had to converse in Korean and abide by the cultural expectations of his youth. Yet, he stayed there for several years, silently residing on the margins of multiple identities and cultures. Bouncing between churches out of spiritual and cultural homelessness, Stephen's inability to separate his Korean identity from his religious past reflects the experiences of many second and third generation Korean Americans. Others express frustration against Christian Confucian-informed norms. For instance, Nam Hae-eun also mentions, familial values played a big part of my life. My parents are divorced, but because Korean culture and Christianity doesn't really recognize divorce as a valid thing, marriage in Korean culture is the merging of two families. And when my parents separated, when I was in 10th grade, both of their parents were trying to get them back together. My grandma would ask me to talk to my dad about getting back with my mom. It wasn't a clean split because the idea of divorce isn't recognized in Christianity. Here, Hae-eun forelays the gripes against the merging of traditional Korean Confucian values and the Christian stigma against divorce, which creates a new layer of complexity to those Korean Americans who do not operate under traditional nuclear family systems. Additionally, common themes of race appeared in multiple interviews, where multiple interviewees expressed frustration over the political inertness of their church in polarizing times like the pandemic. Han Jae-in, she mentions, "We didn't really talk about political issues unless it was about Christianity or a Korean person. Like Black Lives Matter? Nothing. Even the DREAM Act and DACA. It never really expanded the scope. Everything had to be linked to Asian issues. All these issues affected all of us and feed into each other, but being ignorant about these issues is just not helpful to anyone. I think I was cognizant about how so many people at the church failed me, gave me a sense of criticality and pessimism." While Korean American relationships to church may marginalize and exclude those outside of heteronormative nuclear family boundaries, nearly every single interviewee, so yes, there's definitely a racial element to the frustration against church as well. But when an anonymous interviewee moved to Tennessee to attend a white Southern church in her youth, she told me how she was so appalled by her past behavior against her non-Christian friends. She describes to me, and I quote, "When I moved to Tennessee, I began to question the way that I grew up and how that influenced how I see the world. I had arguments with my friends about God and heaven at the age of like 10 or 12. That was disgusting. I don't even know who I'm praying for anymore. That Catholic kid is still super deeply within me. What triggered that realization? It was imminent, a painful realization I can't pinpoint an exact moment, but I was really, really unhappy with my religion in the situation that I was in." Like I mentioned earlier, Korean American relationships to church oftentimes marginalize and exclude those outside of these heteronormative traditional nuclear family systems. Nearly every single interviewee, despite this, associated church with a deep sense of nostalgia. I think there were really important lessons I learned, and that there were positive examples of leaders and friends that I still draw upon that made me realize that I wasn't alone either. I don't think I was ever able to grieve for the things I had gone through, and always felt like I needed to bow or keel over as if nothing had happened, and these people didn't F you over. Rest is resistance. I think that was written by a Black female theologian. Grief and grieving is a part of the healing process. It's inherently and intrinsically intertwined. Reading that made me feel like, oh, there are some good things in the church. There are some good things about Christianity. And I started to more deeply process the relationships that had allowed me to feel grateful again. Like Hannah, while struggling for decades, Kyung-gun, whose quote I mentioned earlier, eventually found solace in making films, where he continues to utilize his upbringing in the church as a creative medium for reconciling his queer, Christian, and Korean identities. Many report that after years of estrangement from the church, they find themselves being pulled back for the community that once harmed them, seeking to redefine what religion means to them as adults. When asked about the future direction of Korean spirituality and the relevance of church for future generations of Korean Americans, Pastor Daniel Cho mentioned to me, "Church is like a book club that has not moved on from the same book for the past 2,000 years." It's changing, but not going anywhere. My intention with this project was not to villainize the church, but to help others understand the relationship, the contentious relationship between Korean American identity and Christianity, and to dismantle the barriers of communication that surround religious trauma. Church is a ground for experimentation. People do not leave the church just to escape feelings of marginalization, but for the sake of experimentation, self-definement, and self-empowerment. And as Korean Americans continue to move to define their identities in relation or in juxtaposition against the church, future scholarship is required to continue to document this Kyopo identity. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Taryn. Taryn is a born and raised Philadelphian and a founder of Ginger Arts Center and Students for the Preservation of Chinatown, organizations which engage Asian American youth and college students in leadership, arts, and activism. Both organizations were involved in opposition to a proposed basketball arena in Philadelphia, Chinatown. Her history thesis on oral histories within the Philadelphia Chinatown community is inspired by her family's role in community-led efforts to preserve Chinatown and grow an Asian American political movement. Taryn is a graduating senior, a Mayer Scholar, and former chair of the Asian Pacific Student Coalition at Penn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming out today. Like Professor Farnsworth's lovely introduction said, my name is Taryn Flaherty. My thesis is Legacies of Resistance, Oral Histories of Movement Building in Philadelphia's Chinatown. The period that I'm looking at is 1966 to around 1997, 1995. And I'm specifically looking at youth activism in relation to very large development projects in the neighborhood. This includes the Vine Street Expressway, the Convention Center, many, many different projects. And I obviously come from an oral history perspective, looking at history and memory and the relationships that are formed in this neighborhood. And so my thesis really starts when I was 5 years old, when I participated in my very first protest, when the Philadelphia Chinatown community was facing a casino proposal in the neighborhood. I attended school in Chinatown at the Folk Arts Cultures Treasures Charter School, where my mom was a founding member. She was the in-house Kung Fu teacher. And the casino proposal only came a couple years after a stadium proposal, which was also proposed to be built in the heart of the neighborhood. And both these fights against the casino, against the stadium, they were uphill battles. It was Chinatown against corporate developers with millions backing their projects, with the mayor and city council backing their projects. And yet Asian American leaders in Philadelphia led mass campaigns that shook Philadelphia. I may have been very, very young. I was 5 years old, but truly no one had to tell me why it was important to take to the streets. I saw firsthand and felt it firsthand of why it was important, what was possible when a community organized. I watched my teachers, my aunties, uncles who raised me, my own mom stand against who represented the most powerful in the neighborhood, and they won. It wasn't until I was much, much older that I learned that I was growing up with leaders of an Asian American movement in Philadelphia. And so my main question in my thesis is, how did a small neighborhood like Chinatown, a small working class, predominantly immigrant, predominantly non-English speaking neighborhood, stand up against corporations and win and build an Asian American movement that, led to the neighborhoods winning against a basketball arena most recently? What fortified this community for decades, for win after win? And so this is kind of a very broad overview, but movements aren't built overnight. They require networks of people, coalition building, and not only the will to fight, but the true trust that they will prevail. And so evolving threats to the Asian American communities in Philadelphia throughout the 70s to the 90s brought forth Asian American leaders, community organizing, developed an inclination towards resistance, and sharpened a new generation of young leaders in the neighborhood who were committed to activism. And so this period is marked by a lot of mass demolition projects, and this period is mostly understood through infrastructure and demolition, but my project seeks to redefine this history more through the lens of people and what they remember. So it's more of a history of resistance rather than a history of development. And I focus on a lot of lived experience of young people in this neighborhood. And they eventually become what we now know as many community leaders through grassroots organizing. And so these young people help build a greater Asian American movement that fundamentally changed the landscape of Asian American communities and activism in Philadelphia. And so my first chapter is called Sitting on Rubble. It mostly focuses on the Vine Street Expressway project that lasts from 1966 to 1973. And this includes the rise of many youth organizations like the Yellow Seeds that I will talk a little further about, and also the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation, PCDC, which is one of the largest community organizations in Philadelphia's Chinatown today. My second chapter then moves into the 1980s, or late 1970s, 1980s, and it focuses on how Asian American activism in Philadelphia is changed by Southeast Asian refugee resettlement in the country and in Philadelphia, because a lot of Asian American leaders who are, they're coming into their, Asian American identity in the 70s, and then a total shift in the city happens. And a lot of leaders are moved by the struggle by a lot of Southeast Asian refugees. And then finally, in my last chapter, it's called Made by Chinatown for Chinatown, and it focuses a lot on youth investment and leans more into the developmental aspect of when PCDC starts leaning into how the government is not going to provide affordable housing, not going to provide elderly housing for a lot of the elders in the neighborhood. So thus, they step up as the main form of, housing developers in the neighborhood. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Vine Street Expressway, because I think most people know where the Vine Street Expressway is. This photo is from the Yellow Seeds newspaper. So the Yellow Seeds were a young people's organization. They were known as radicals in the neighborhood. And a lot of them were college students. So in the Vine Street Expressway fight, I talk about two main categories of young people who are, coming into being in this time period. It's those who are born and raised in Chinatown, those who are fighting against the Vine Street Expressway because their literal, places of work, their parents' house is being demolished. And then also young people who are going to college at Penn, some are from Princeton, some are, high school students. Those who are coming into, this idea of, yellow power, black power, the Third World Liberation Front, coming in from a more political lens. And so if you want to look at the, timeline, 1966 is when the proposal is first introduced, and that's when PCDC is first formed, and a couple years later, the Yellow Seeds are formed. And the Yellow Seeds are a combination of, Chinatown young people and college students. And so I'll read one of my first oral histories, which was Harry Leong. He is the current pastor of the Chinese Christian Church in Philadelphia's Chinatown, which is one of the longest standing institutions in the neighborhood. And so Harry, I've known for many, many years. He's known me since I was probably, not even a foot tall. And so he lived across the street from the first demolition site for the Vine Street Expressway. And so he says, I remember there was a picture of Bill Baldini, a TV reporter, and the members of the Chinatown community, kids from the community sitting on top of the rubble. It's an iconic picture that people often see. I lived across the street from where they were standing on top of. I remember there was some issues at the point they were knocking down the buildings, and there were people climbing up on top of the rubble site, and that's how I remember it as a kid. It was just protesting. I remember Mary Yee was on top of there. Mary Yee is a member of the Yellow Seeds, and he particularly mentions the Philadelphia Suns and how he recognized 5 or 6 of the Suns members. And the Philadelphia Suns were a basketball team, a long-standing basketball team in Philadelphia's Chinatown, and still exists today. And it was truly because of the basketball team members that Harry knew. They were like his older brothers, that he later tells me, but it was because of them that he, eventually, goes up as a little 8-year-old kid on top of this rubble site. I also interviewed one of the first Philadelphia Suns members who, I guess, started this protest. His name is Joseph Lowe. He's there in the middle in the white hat and the white crew socks. And so he told me, under that rubble, when I was in high school, I worked there part-time right on that corner. The day was rainy. It was in August 1973. My sister came and woke me up and said, they're knocking down the building. It was 6:30 in the morning. My friend Kevin, who is right next to him with the sunglasses, we're standing on the corner and just saying, what are we going to do? It was just the two of us at first. So we didn't think about it. We just walked up, sat on the rubble, and refused to leave. As the day went on, a lot of our friends started walking up and they all joined us. Joe does not identify as a political individual, neither back then or today, but it was truly about this community, this building that had like been where he had worked all his life. And so this protest captured the entire city's attention, with reporters flooding in, including Bill Baldini. And Harry said, so Harry and Joe are two young people who grew up in the neighborhood, but also there were those who were coming, from outside of the neighborhood. So Ignatius was one of my interviews who actually came from Taiwan, and he was an architect who had just graduated from grad school. And for him, his introduction into activism was just, a coworker, a colleague who said, let me take you out to lunch, and then took him to an organizing meeting in Chinatown. There he met Mary Yi, who was, just a young 23-year-old, 24-year-old, and she was actually radicalized by Gordon Chang, who was a huge activist on the West Coast with Yellow Power and anti-Vietnam War activism. And so these are kind of like the two camps that are becoming truly moved by the Vine Street Expressway. And to go back to Ignatius and Mary, the two of them, from a developmental perspective, you wouldn't know anything about them. They don't build anything together. They don't, officially work together in any organization. But the two of them are lifelong friends. Ignatius refers to Mary as his little sister. And from a perspective that looks at Chinatown's history from just truly infrastructure, you would not care about their relationship. It would not matter. However, it is like, these are a duo. Ignatius and Mary are a duo, a very powerful duo that, saved the Holy Redeemer Church and School that was threatened to be demolished by the Vine Street Expressway. Obviously, the Vine Street Expressway was built, but the church and school was one of the rallying points that a lot of the community was trying to save. And so a lot of my research was kind of initially based off of these two relationship, about how it really wouldn't have mattered otherwise. And so then we kind of move into the 1980s. And so if we follow Mary, for example, she is now seeing the Southeast Asian refugee resettlement in Philadelphia, and she's actually moved to shift her activism away from Chinatown and into the pockets of Southeast Asian refugees that are popping up in North Philly, in West Philly, and in South Philly. And this is also a time where new activists are being introduced to Asian American activism in Philadelphia. So for example, Debbie Way, who many people who have kept up with the current Save Chinatown fight definitely know Debbie's name, but she was truly introduced into activism because of Southeast Asian refugee resettlement. She then goes on to found Asian Americans United, which is the first broad Asian American community organizing group. And the idea for Asian Americans United was hatched over Debbie's kitchen table and over a community legal services conference table at Juniper and Locust in 1985. And so it was initially just a group of Asian Americans who wanted to invest in actually young people. The Southeast Asian refugee resettlement struggle focused heavily on young people. And it was because of Debbie Way, Mary Yi, who were just individuals trying to organize among Southeast Asian refugees against housing issues, school issues. It was because of those individuals that they found Asian Americans United. And so Asian Americans United then introduces or inspires budding activists like Ellen Samakawa. So Ellen Samakawa, she was a third-generation Japanese American. She was a child of families who were incarcerated in internment camps during World War II, but she lived in white suburbs, and so she wasn't really politically active until she, got to college. She was involved in a lot of anti-war activism, and suddenly decides when she takes 10 years to complete her undergrad degree that she wants to run away. She wants to run away from all the activism. She wants to move on, and so she runs away to Philadelphia. And for the first few months, she, is a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania. She tries to ignore her feelings for activism, and she is incredibly unsuccessful. She told me it was like trying to be this other person and not this political person. And then I suddenly couldn't live in my skin. I just couldn't keep going and pretending like I didn't have this other consciousness in my brain. So eventually she, dabbles in a little activism. She volunteers with the Rainbow Coalition in Philadelphia. And suddenly she's getting a ride home from one of the fellow volunteers that tell her about Debbie Way and this new Asian Americans United. And she uses a old-fashioned phone book to look up Debbie Way's number. And the next thing I know, I'm sitting in Debbie's living room with the board of Asian Americans United, and I was truly speaking the same language as these people. Ellen continues on to run Asian Americans United's first youth program and never completes her PhD, but is continually fighting for justice in Philadelphia's Chinatown. And so I tell you kind of all these little tidbits of these stories because those are the moments that truly stuck out to people who lived in this time period. It wasn't quite the housing issues were definitely in the background. The demolition was definitely in the background. But when people who actually lived through this history reflect on this time period, they name, the role models in their life. They name the community organizations. They may name individuals and individual relationships that truly move them. And so that's what my thesis mainly focuses on. I particularly chose oral histories because I didn't really want to create new languages and impose new languages onto very pre-existing stories. My thesis heavily relies on words of those who actually built this neighborhood and its histories, which are my interviewees and other oral history projects. So two, namely, are the Asian Arts Initiative's Chinatown Lives, which was one of the first oral histories in 2004, documenting Philadelphia Chinatown. And then most recently, there has been the Asian Americans United Art Chinatown Project, which was in 2023. And then I conducted about 12 oral histories of my own. And I think what's really important is that these oral histories are not just used as like contextualization to a time period of development. Their voices actually are, the way to document their lives, understand their motivations, understand this history, and seek where they found their strength in this time period that was deeply traumatizing. And so when all of our class knows that all the history majors are constantly asking, so what? So what all these stories, so what they felt like moved by each other, what does that even mean? And so my thesis is very much rooted in individual stories and individual histories. And it highlights, obviously, this anti-progress narrative that comes with a lot of Chinatown's history. A lot of people see all these Save Chinatown movements, Save Chinatown coalitions, and think, oh, Chinatown is anti-progress, they're anti-development. But that is not true. Even looking through these oral histories, Chinatown is a neighborhood that builds. And so my project doesn't just highlight, agency, progress, development of this neighborhood, but it also highlights how important it is to live in relation to one another. It is not just about what is built, but also physically built, but also what is built between people, and why are these memories and these relationships between people able to stand up against huge corporations, huge demolition projects. And so a nicer way to say this is what my thesis asserts the autonomy and agency of the Chinatown community members in the face of displacement from their homes. It also reflects the significance of interwoven communities and relationships as a source of strength for many rising Asian American leaders to build better for their communities. Chinatown leaders today come from a very long line of fighters and protesters who are also dreamers and builders for the neighborhood. So this legacy of resistance in Philadelphia's Chinatown reflects a long-term investment in housing, in development, obviously, but also in youth programs and intergenerational leadership and in another generation of young people. And so rather than seeing, Chinatown as solely through infrastructure, I look at Chinatown more through the intricate relationships that are built in this neighborhood. And so when we also think of another generation of leaders, a lot of the activists of the 70s, of the 80s, of the 90s, they didn't just complete their work and call it a good day's work, of hard work. They continued to build. And so they built a school, they built cultural centers, they built new churches, places of worship. And those were the institutions that raised another generation of leaders that fought against the basketball arena in the most recent years. It was the school that Debbie Way, Ellen Samakawa, and my mom, Helen Gim, built that raised, me, a lot of the youth leaders who were crucial in the basketball arena fight, and that won. And so I think a lot of my project just focuses on why communities can rely so heavily on the relationships between each other to win. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to now introduce Amanda Rodriguez. Amanda is a junior double majoring in art history and Latin American and Latinx studies. Her current interests focus on border studies, storytelling, and Mexican American history. As a first-generation low-income student from Southern Texas, she centers her research and writing on the intersection of personal narratives with theoretical frameworks in history and art history. Building on these interests, her current project explores intergenerational oral histories within her family, interweaving these stories within the evolving fortification of the US-Mexico border and the social conditions that perpetuates. Outside of Wolf, Amanda is a Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellow and a work study student in the Art History Department. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Am I here audible? Okay. So thank you for showing up. This is my project. It's called Borders, Border Unraveling Narratives Along the Rio Grande. And I produced this project with like a lot of passion, but because I'm a big fan of writing a paper and then making a script that's completely different from it, but still intertwined with it. I've been able to talk to a lot of my family through this project, but I'm gonna mainly be focusing on my mother, who I wanna talk about what our interview entailed, but also what connections we found with each other through it, because this is an intergenerational history that I'm part of. So let's go. In their April 1977 issue, magazine Texas Monthly would feature an article by Kay Northcott, a freelance writer at the time who would go on to become a main voice in Texas magazine journalism as a feminist voice and activist. Her article, All Roads Lead from Roma, Texas, would be considered a common edition in Texas Monthly, another article covering a rural town, highlighting what was special in it, one of the many in the vast territory Texas entraps within its borders. In the Northcott article, Roma, Texas, a border town with a population of no more than 1,000 people at the time, would be elevated from an agricultural community to the capital of marijuana. Roma was the second largest settlement in Stark County at the time. As quoted, Stark County is a barren hunk of brushland, never able to muster more than a first in poverty and unemployment. News from this dusty down and out county, with its 98% Spanish surname population, usually concerns a new case of leprosy and a convoy of wetbacks, flush from the Rio Grande. Blatantly, the tabloid article, one of many covering the subject, is written to satiate an American taste for criminal activity and subsequent policing. And it did so by throwing one of Texas's most marginalized Hispanic communities under scandal and under a marginalizing gaze. But I present this today not to continue to wrestle with its contradictions in its racist language. I present it as a background for why I chose to interview my mom. Ana Gonzalez was born in 1961 in Rio Grande City, Texas, which is the largest city in Stark County, Texas today. She was 16 years old when a storm of tabloids swept through her community, sensationalizing the border, its people, and its perceived dangers. By the 1970s, Stark County was home to deeply rooted communities of Mexican-American migrant workers and ranching families, like Ana's, who lived on both sides of the Rio Grande for generations before and after the drawing of the borderline. And yet, despite this deep history, these communities became the target of a derogatory marginalizing narrative, as I said so before, that sought to define them from a view outside. That sentiment, that framing, never truly left, and it resurfaces in the small acts of storytelling passed down in my family, and a line on which I quote in this slide, which is not new. I'm just trying to emphasize that it's remained. I approached this interview not only as a scholar, but as a receiving member of it, someone who inherits and carries the intergenerational memory of my family. My mother has never left our community. She has lived in Rio Grande City for most of her life. And I think often, if it weren't for my education, maybe I wouldn't have left either. But it's through her memory, through the stories of family, of neighbors, and of daily life that I've come to understand our town. Her stories and my family's stories layer onto my own experience and create a mental map, a space that is at once deeply personal and deeply shared. And so, this is just a picture of the church. I have come to see the border as an open wound, as I have heard, an unhealing scar. I have come to understand this as a wound that cuts over and over again through the land, layered with the histories of violence, movement, survival, and importantly, memory. Blood has run again and again across this place, now isolated between the borderline along the Rio Grande and by the checkpoints that guard every road leading north. This disruption didn't begin with the recent political shifts or a modern surveillance technological apparatus. It's rooted in a much older legacy, one of American expansionism and any colonial project really, which still echoes in every act of border enforcement today. What perhaps is most grim is how the system not only divides life, but can come to structure it. This, of course, is through social elements of language standardization, of racialization, and labor. However, it is overlooked that for many in the poor southern communities of South Texas, border enforcement has become one of the few viable paths to an economic stability, offering jobs even as it deepens the very system of control and surveillance that mark everyday lives. It is within the context of systemic division and structural survival that my mother's story unfolds. Having worked as a border inspector before I was born, her experience exists outside of the bounds of a conventional academic history, narrative interwoven with power and contradiction. I ask myself, how did she seek upward mobility in a setting where segregation and policing were designed to limit opportunity? How did she navigate the tensions of resisting desperation while the very border fortification that shaped her life expanded? Even as she became an agent of the state, she remained at her core a daughter of the community, forever shaped by the complexities and contradictions of life along a border. It is precisely these silences, the narratives erased by the border's imposition, that I seek to uncover in my project. I come in this project not to argue for a revisionist history narrative like the ones already constructed, nor to supplement an archive that reflects and extends the workings of power that exist. Rather, I aim to highlight in this oral history how the silences and histories were produced, how the border once mapped made a community's memories illegible to everyone but themselves. Both sides of my family have lived in the lower Rio Grande Valley for at least 5 generations. On my mother's side, both her parents came from migrant agricultural backgrounds. They often observed a deep intimacy with the land around them, even as the land was precarious. Paraphrasing her briefly, we lived in a house that sits along the bank of the Rio Grande. There were stories passed down about how boats used to dock behind our house. The river once flowed much closer, but over time it shifted. Now the water is further away. And those memories aren't just stories. They are the foundations of place which my family holds. That's like a map. I live on Water Street. I didn't like demarcate it, but like it's like very short. It's about like, I'll get to it. Okay. The foundations of place. My grandfather would build a home there. That's her grandfather, sorry. And my mother would grow up surrounded by fields that shaped her childhood. Her parental grandfather built that house about half a mile from the river. My mother told me, we lived right off the bank of the Rio Grande. There were 3 fields around our house and behind our house, and that was our playground. We were always out there playing near the river. We had so much fun. It was a small town in the 1960s. The population was maybe 6,000. We lived in the center of town. There was a kiosco, the courthouse, and the church just north of there. It is this mapping of her life that I find mine. I would grow up in the same house. My grandparents would raise me there with her, and the buildings she describes are still standing, and I see them every day when I'm there. But a part that changed, a part that speaks to the passage of time and the expansions of the state, is that the river is the river itself. The river is no longer a part of my field of vision. Yes, my relationship to my mother's childhood is shaped less by my own experience than her stories. Yet the physical river, once a space of play, has been redefined through militarizations. I inherit not the freedom and intimacy with land that my family held as inhabitants and workers of the land, but the conditions of its restriction. By the time I was born, the fields behind our house had been abandoned, and a thick forest grew in its place. I never got to see the river like my mom did. My mother's first job was as a migrant worker along her family in the citrus farms of Stark County in West Texas, where my grandfather worked seasonally in the fields. Places like La Casita, once active orchards, had been since shuttered, and their names live on as the namesakes for barrios across my town, embedded agricultural communities with history into the geography of the everyday life itself. My mother packed melons and onions while her older brother operated a forklift, and her father and her younger brothers picked in the fields. There were collective familial efforts to survive a region that offered few alternatives. Yet, my mom tells me today, there's not many jobs here. You either work for the county, the hospital, or the school district. Otherwise, it's whatever job you can find, and a low-paying one at that. I remember earning $3 an hour. Some people in Rio Grande or Rio Grande are still working for minimum wage, which isn't even $8. But because it's a small town, you can still live off of it, not like in big cities. This quote anchors a local truth within the broader political context of my town, a restricted labor economy structured by geography, racialized governance, and underdevelopment. The scarcity of opportunities is not an accident, but systemic, and so the work of survival becomes intergenerational. From a childhood playing in fields to laboring in them. My mother's adolescence was shaped by the agricultural economy of Stark County that suffered its own historical marginalization and exploitation. But as the citrus groves disappeared and the economy structures shifted, by like the mid 1970s. So too did the nature of the work. Though Anna briefly attended college at Pan American University, Gloria Anzaldua's alma mater, I may add, she left after a semester to work as a dispatcher for the local sheriff's office. In a field where gender roles were sharply drawn, she eventually became a deputy sheriff, the first in her family to hold such a position. She's in the corner. She's like the tall lady in the left. She's about my height. Yet the symbolic breakthrough of becoming a deputy did not translate into financial security. Her wages remained below average, and eventually she applied to work as a border inspector for the U.S. Customs Service. This was the name before it changed. This career shift marked a complex transition from being embedded in the family of agricultural laborers to becoming a state agent tasked with policing the very routes her people once took to labor and to live, to visit family, and to access affordable food and health care. It's obvious that none of these people had insurance. By the early 1980s, Stark County had begun to transform, not away from agriculture entirely, but towards a new kind of infrastructure being invested in by restructuring immigration policy and attitudes. One built on surveillance and border enforcement. The same land that once hosted orchards and citrus groves now holds many more checkpoints and federal outposts than normal, and it employs the children of migrant workers to do the work. In her position on the port of entry on the bridges spanning from the Rio Grande to Roma, so like my town, Rio Grande City, Roma's about like a 10-minute drive, and then sometimes she worked at a bridge that was like about 5 minutes up because the river starts to curve upward where we're at in Stark County. My mother was quite literally the face of the American border security apparatus. She was a Hispanic woman who would stand at the bridge, fluent in both English and Spanish, though her proper Spanish, as she jokes, only came after formal classes given by her employers. She was not allowed to learn proper like English or like Spanish writing in like Catholic school. Like if she spoke it, she would get hit. So this is her reflection in her words. We worked through summer heat, freezing cold winters, especially during the holidays. You know, during Christmas it was cold, and you had a line that stretched across town. It never stopped. It was constant. You were freezing your butt off and you did your job. It was hard because you were a woman in a man's job. At any time, there were more men, only 1 or 2 women, and I got along with everyone. But I got along with everyone, with everybody. We were there to read people. If they came in, you had to tell if they were lying, if they were really US citizens. Her labor was physical, emotional, and always under scrutiny. She carried the weight of authority, yet remained deeply embedded in the community she tasked with surveilling through interaction and invasion. However, by the mid-1990s, after nearly a decade of service and amid the tightening grip of border policy, evolving visa requirements, and increasing militarization, my mother made the decision to resign from this position. What lingered, though, was not the physical exhaustion, but an emotional toll. She reflects, I'm a Hispanic, and you become prejudiced against people from Mexico. Everybody does. Nobody can say that they don't. You become prejudiced with your own, with the Mexicans, with the other people from other countries, because the thing is, your job is to enforce the law, and you're judging everybody. You don't trust anybody. You think everybody is going to try to pull the wool over your eyes. Her words reveal an uncomfortable truth, one that she can only fully reflect on now after leaving the bridge, and more broadly, stepping away from the surveillance system. Even as she served, even as she believed she was protecting, she internalized the suspicion that the surveillance state cast against any person in proximity in the border to be suspicious, especially someone marginalized, racialized, and casted as the other within the US imperial project. Over time, my mother felt a slow erosion of empathy, where the act of enforcing the line began to fracture her connection to her own community and her identity. This was the cost of becoming part of the border for my mother, an enduring tension between duty and the human connections she once shared with her community. At the end of the interview, my mother reflects on some of the judgments she had about her time as a border inspector, particularly regarding her life, what her life might have been like without the demanding nature of the job. She worked a lot of long hours. And of course, whether I would have been born if she had stayed in the position she had always wanted. She had always wanted a child also. She recounts a particularly difficult case then, in the middle of our interview. You know, sometimes I had people come in with babies, right? A US citizen who had a baby in Mexico, and you have to ask all these different questions to figure out if it's really their child. I had a case where the baby wasn't theirs. The woman said she had it in Mexico, and it wasn't true. I felt bad, but I had to. These contradictions are part of her story, and they reflect the painful complexities and realities that the border creates in its construction, how the border invaded her space the same way it did mine. It becomes clear now that the disparities of life along the border cannot be reduced to mere binaries of good and bad or north or south. Such reductions only serve to obscure the stark abnormalities of the border itself. These moments of reflection shape the ongoing story of life lived on a constantly fortified and shifting boundary. Through my birth and the passing down of these personal stories, along with many others from my family, I present this work, and in doing so, near its conclusion. I write with a deep sadness about what the border has become, and I share these memories and images as centers of love, resilience, and the rich exchanges of intergenerational remembrance that expose the limitations of the border's ability to define itself. My family can still share their stories. In this, I challenge the narrative constructed by tabloid articles and firmly declare that the border was never a fixed truce. It remains an incomplete project, one that attempts to naturalize what is not factual, seeking to silence the history of the Rio Grande, a river and region that will continue to shape the lives of those who live along its banks on its own accord. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amy Offner, and I teach in the history department. And I just so enjoyed getting to hear how all of your research has developed over the last several years. These were really phenomenal presentations, and they kind of reinforce, I think, for all of us here, what a privilege it is to teach students like you. I have, I guess, a couple of questions for each of you. One is a question for Seyoon, actually. The quote that you close with from the pastor, Daniel Cho, who says that church is like a book club, and the book hasn't changed in 2,000 years. And he says, I think I have that right, it's changing, but it's not going anywhere. And I just wanted to hear you say more about how you interpret that comment from him. When I hear that quote, it's not going anywhere could mean two different things. One is frustration with lack of change, and the other is kind of pride in like the maintenance of community that has some kind of a foundation. I'm Jewish, and Jews would say this, meaning we are the people of the book. This is how we constantly reinterpret and fight with each other over the meaning of life and what you're supposed to do here. And so the we're not going anywhere could have actually a positive meaning that talks about the kind of reinvention of community through textual argumentation. But I wondered like what this pastor meant by that. And then a question for Taryn and Amanda. Both of you have such amazing research into how these two different either people or communities were encountering extremely violent and oppressive forms of state power. And they get also entangled in it in a lot of different ways. And I wondered if you could sort of say more about how they reflected on or related to government in its many forms. I mean, Amanda, you have such an amazing kind of portrait of your mother reflecting herself on the contradictions of her both treatment and her entanglement with the, Border Patrol and the institutions that police the border. And I wondered if there were other ways in which her life kind of intersected with government institutions, whether through kind of the afterlives of the war on poverty and the welfare state, whether through, lots of other kinds of institutions, and how did she kind of reflect on kind of her place in relation to government power, which has so many faces? And Taryn, it was so interesting, the famous picture of the youth sitting on top of the rubble. They say your tax dollars at work, and there's this just really powerful indictment of the use of state power to displace and immiserate people. And I wondered how the activists you're talking about, many of whom sometimes turn to forms of private investment, private institutions, how they related in an ongoing way also to government power over time.
I can start us off. So thank you so much for the question. I think that I included that quote as the ending quote in the first place because I really wanted to kind of emphasize the open-endedness of the future. I think that it's really important that you're bringing out this study or this your personal experience with like coming from a Jewish background, because diasporic studies in the first place was born out of this kind of longing for the home, out of Jewish studies. And so when you think about the Korean American community, there's always been this innate longing for the home. I think that because of the context in which Koreans even came to America was under, like I mentioned, Japanese imperialism. In 1910, Korea was formally annexed by the empire. And so innately, even the second that they came to America, there was this intense longing for the home, which no longer existed. Korea was no longer a country. It was a colony of Japan. And so I think that in kind of that sense, that's kind of what I was gunning for as well. But also because what I didn't mention in the interview was that Pastor Daniel Cho also mentioned that he was saying about the future of the generations that will inherit the church after him. They would be English speaking, not Korean. And so I think that you're definitely right to point out that there's definitely this kind of more abstract sense of like, what is to come, like how church is moving forward, because you're going to see a slow, like gradual loss of, I guess, this traditional sense of culture and these like more traditional markers of like language and stuff and heritage. But at the same time, this doesn't deny the fact that these people are also still very much very Christian. And I think that they're fashioning new types of expression and ways that they're kind of like practicing their religion as well. I think that, I think not only just becoming more English speaking, it also has to do with the fact that they are not being as conservative as maybe their more immigrant generation churches are. I also think that they're becoming more multi-ethnic as well. A lot of their, especially churches in Los Angeles nowadays, are very much becoming more inclusive to not just Koreans, but also other minorities as well. So that's kind of why I wanted to keep that quote in, because I don't really know exactly what he meant, but that's my interpretation of it. Yeah, thank you again.
Okay, hi. I think of how she's been entangled and still is partly. Like I obviously can't share everything that I know about her. I feel like I know everything about her. It's that like her brothers are also entangled. She would get a job for my brother, for not my brother, her brother, in like the 1990s, and he's now like currently the top mechanic for the Border Patrol, like cars. And it was because he wanted to be a mechanic, and she's like, oh, there's this new job that's opening up and I've heard about it, you can get it. And so my uncle's still part of it. I've asked him about it, but I don't think he wants to talk about it much because he's still employed by them, because Border Patrol is still like some of the highest paying positions in my area. It's partly why people are opposed to like the idea of a wall, because if you have the wall, you want to employ people that work like in cars and on horses. It's a very interesting talking point. But also I think about what she does that always kept her out of it, like why she's able to come to these realizations, because she still had these certain like ways of moving through the land that her grandfather had. Like my grandfather was undocumented all of his life, and it was because when it would come and show, he was undocumented and unemployed, but it was because he worked in Mexico and then came and lived in America all the time. So high unemployment rates from the tabloid are, it's just like people just don't want to work within this US system that was like really taxing and oppressive. And my mom kind of keeps that. She does nursing jobs that are very under the table. She buys medicine in Mexico and goes into my town, and she gives medicine to people that don't have insurance and can't travel. And so like it's like she's still able to like keep an independence from it, and she has like a bunch of crazy adventures that I can't mention. But yeah.
crazy adventures. I like that. I think for the Chinatown community, cooperation with the government and also like the private development arms, it becomes two separate groups in Chinatown, almost two separate factions. Those align more with PCDC, so the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation. They decide to go kind of all in on housing, and because they need federal grants, they most recently were the recipient of Joe Biden's capping the highway project. They're able to, or they operate in the space that is very much in cooperation with the government. And that leads to a lot of clashes, internal clashes, both back then and today. Back then, Yellow Seeds was kind of the balancing arm to PCDC. A lot of the Yellow Seeds' newspapers critique PCDC endlessly, but even when I interview the founders of Yellow Seeds, they're like, yeah, we love the individuals. We just wanted to publicly critique them, to push them to go farther or to be better. And I think that has somewhat extended today, where Asian Americans United, even the Philadelphia Suns, they play in the same building that PCDC owns. They're all in relationship to each other, but they occupy different spaces. So even Joe Civlow, who is one of the first protesters, he's not a part of PCDC. He honestly disagreed. He was going on and on for like 20 minutes in our interview about how he disagrees with the, director of PCDC, but they're best friends, like they're longtime family friends. And I think that really reflects the relationships in the neighborhood, where you can disagree to endless extents, but at the end of the day, they're all trying to live in this neighborhood because they all live here. I think one of the tidbits that I thought was really fun was that the current executive director of PCDC has definitely been the object of a lot of controversy in the neighborhood. Him and Debbie Way disagree all the time, but there's only so much that they can disagree, because Debbie Way was his art teacher when he was younger. And so it's this relationship where everybody kind of knows each other, and there's some minimum ground that they will agree on. And so I think it definitely leads to a lot of internal clashes, but it's never publicly acknowledged, I think. Thank you for the questions.
One at a time.
Thank you. It seems like for y'all, your personal lives and experiences informed your research interests to various degrees. I was just curious as to how you found your own idea and conception of your communities challenged or changed in the process of conducting these interviews and working on your theses.
Who would like to take it?
I feel like you have a pretty good.
I have a good one. Okay,
Sorry to
sure.
this.
I'll start us off strong. Thank you so much for the question. I think, I guess talking a little bit more about my personal life, I definitely grew up in the Christian church, so I knew what it was like growing up in a very Methodist, kind of conservative family and household. I think my historical kind of baptism and getting involved with this project in the first place involved in around 2013-ish, there was an announcement that was basically done by all the United Methodist churches across America, most of which are actually Korean in the Northeast. And so they basically said that there was going to be a fracture in the church, that half the churches would be leaving the denomination to start their own kind of branch, kind of like the mainline branch, if you've heard of that. And that is a difference. The reason why that split happened in the first place was over the issue of gay marriage. And so it was kind of this crux of issue between these two, I guess, different perspectives. And so obviously as a child, I think interpreting that kind of made me really want to kind of step away from the church for a little bit. And so I think that was kind of my first moment where I started to question what is church? What does it really mean? Because I think that it's undeniable in my presentation that a lot of Korean Americans cannot separate their Korean identity with church, because it's so intrinsically related to each other. Because if you grow up in a very white area like I did, my high school was around 98% white. And so church was really the only chance for me to actually be able to kind of speak in Korean even. And so I think in terms of kind of the perspective, kind of shifting a little bit, I very much came into this mentality of like, oh, some churches, Korean churches are typically a little bit more conservative. They're going to be kind of, I kind of just had a lot of negative, I guess, heuristics, I say with some shame. But after doing a lot of the interviews, I realized that there's actually so much diversity in perspective. Like this methodology and the theology of like kind of like maybe why they might not be so interested in like a same-sex marriage, it's really rooted in a lot of like really interesting rhetoric that they explained to me. It was just I didn't really know how many like liberal pastors there really were, because there were so many, and these were people who were extremely well educated and extremely well informed. Even if I didn't necessarily agree with their values, they knew what they were talking about, and they literally have masters in divinity and things like that. And so I think generally, my perspective changed a lot, I think, after doing this, and it gave me a lot of closure to do it as well.
I can go. It makes me reflect a lot. Like, I didn't know I wanted to go to college till like my last possible fall in high school. But I knew if I wanted to go to college, I wanted to do something I liked. My mom was like really helpful, but like also because she had like a very limited experience with college, she could only really help me like be like, oh, be a lawyer, be a doctor. So I came in and I kind of got into Penn, and I was like, okay, I need to like go full drive into like my historic interests, because I've always just had them. And like, I'm so glad you both are here, Offner and Farnsworth, because I both took classes with you, that I like kind of had a realization. It's like, oh yeah, like when this one random advisor guy who went to Yale was he's like, you don't live in a normal place. You realize that? He's like, no one has these experiences like you do. So I kind of like came into Offner's class, and I found like a picture of someone my mom knew at like a farm workers protest. And I was like, oh wow, I'm like kind of connected in that. And I kind of like been going full hard into that. But also I like writing a lot. So I feel like I'm glad that I'm able to have like these nice, eloquent writing sessions. But also like my mom, she didn't struggle with this interview at all. She was like, oh, I'll tell you everything, because she's really supportive of what I have going on now. And she likes participating in it, and she likes knowing history too. Yeah.
I think mine is somewhat similar to Amanda's, where when I initially started my thesis project, I was trying to, or I guess, remove myself from the history, or like my perspective, and focus on what I would now see as like a colder form of history of the neighborhood, focusing on like, the economic policies, just the development, looking at like government documents, which is equally as important. But I knew that I really wanted to do oral histories. I like grew up, with oral histories incorporated in my school. And so it was truly like the methodology that kind of like curved my path of like what my thesis was actually about and my conclusions. I think it was also a conversation with Huge in my thesis class, where they were like, you are not writing a history of development, you are writing a history of resistance. And I was like, wow, it's October and I need to change my thesis. And so it has also been like really rewarding to have a community like the Wolf Humanities, like the thesis cohort, like Amanda in farm workers class like 3 semesters ago, to kind of like transform my perspective. And so grateful to the Wolf Humanities cohort. Yeah.
Well, despite the fact that that's a nice note on which to end, I think we do have time for another question if there is one. I don't want anybody to feel silenced. So I'll give people just a moment to see if there is. Yes.
Echo Kano, East Asian Languages and Civilizations. I just wanted to thank you all for this really extraordinary set of research you've done. I had a question about language, which is on the title of the panel. And you all three are sort of multilingual in a way that allows you access, I think, to different generations and different members of your communities. And I was curious whether, I think this came out in Amanda's paper the most, but for the others as well, if there were moments in your research when you found sort of reflections or complexities, interesting episodes about language use and language as a barrier as well as a bridge between different people. I also wanted to end with a comment of how extraordinary all of the stories are. And from a slightly older generation that kind of lost the opportunity to ask my parents about their experiences, etc. A plea to those of you who still have older members of your families, do oral histories. I think everyone's story is really extraordinary and interesting and historical. Thank you.
I can go on this. And like the actual paper I wrote for this, I open it because I go to like bingo nights a lot during the summer with my mom. They play like a Spanish version of bingo called Loteria. And I was there like one night and there was this guy, he's like the host for the bingo. And he was like, I don't speak English or Spanish. I don't speak any language. And so I'm like, why? And he's like, well, I don't know how to read or write in Spanish, and I can't really talk in English right because I have this accent. And it's like, that's like a whole thing my community has. It's even like Gloria Anzaldúa writes about it a lot, of like having to take accent classes in the same university my mom went to. Like my mom had to take those accent classes too. It's like, but it's like a result of the border. I felt like I wanted to get to it, but I just have so much going on in this paper. But it's like, yeah, my mom was not really, she has an accent too, and like I've been able to shake it. But it's like a big thing because it is like a big reflection of like what the border does. It makes people feel shameful for not being able to master either. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry about that. I think for the Chinatown community, because even though the neighborhood is very much like predominantly Chinese speaking, and the versus like Cantonese versus Mandarin has definitely changed in 90s, 2000s. Because my project was focusing on the 1970s, people who were young people in the 1970s, those who were here, even though they, some of them were born in America, some were born in Asia, they had been here so long. So a lot of my interviews were in English, or all my interviews were in English, minus the projects or previous oral histories that were actually translated into English. But I thought it was really interesting because my project was initially all about Chinatown. And then from that, through the oral histories, I kind of started to realize that Chinatown organizing definitely fed into a lot of Asian American organizing more broadly, and a lot of Japanese Americans, South Asian Americans, Korean Americans. They don't find their own, Koreatown in Philly or Japantown in Philly. They come into Chinatown, and obviously throughout their stories, there is a barrier. I mean, there's even Chinese Americans who don't speak Chinese and are fully living in Chinatown. Joseph Lowe is one of the examples of that, or one of the examples of those populations. And there's definitely a barrier, right? They're constantly shamed a bit, like both like in a nice way and in a not so nice way. But the Chinatown community is such a center of community organizing and of like very long histories, and incorporation of other Asian Americans, that a lot of the organizing in Philadelphia, a lot of Asian American organizing started in Chinatown. Now has definitely broadened out to South Philly with the very strong Vietnamese community, Southeast Asian community, but definitely has a lot of roots in the Chinatown community.
Yeah, I think I have a little bit more of a mundane answer. I agree with what the previous two panelists have mentioned about kind of the intergenerational conflicts caused by language. I think it's one of the main reasons why people even gravitate to going to church in the first place. It's because, for fresh people who are fresh off the boat, just immigrated to the country, they offer English classes in churches to kind of like help acclimate them, teach them tax information, how to get citizenship, basic things like that. But at the same time, for people like me, third or fourth or fifth generation Korean Americans, they go to church to learn the language because they forgot it and they didn't grow up with it. And so I think a lot of the interviewees have expressed a lot of shame around not being, the reason why they wanted to their proclivity for leaving the church was caused because they didn't have the mother language. So they felt a sense of like, oh, am I even Korean if I don't have that? And so I was very interested in kind of how that both was an obstacle, but also kind of a reconciliation for kind of reconciling their identities, their heritages. But in terms of like actual practical translation work, I definitely did do a lot of it in the presentation. In the paper, I put footnotes on like the original Korean so I could like stay true to myself. But I think I did not take any creative liberties, tried to translate as literally as possible, staying true to the script. So yeah, thank you for the question. That's great.
I want to thank the panelists and also everybody in the audience. So thank you.